Recording again. Now, I'm not sure if this is left over from the previous
Being recorded.
Okay.
But let's start from the beginning here, and I'll edit out anything that might be before.
Yes. Just start from the beginning.
Okay, so hello everybody. We're back with Kevin McAleer. We had an intro to Kevin McAleer in our previous video. He turns out to be an aficionado, at least in some parts of his life and his career as a writer, an aficionado of the works of Ernest Hemingway. So I thought it would be nice to do a deep dive into all the novels of Ernest Hemingway. Kevin, you know, what is the significance of Ernest Hemingway in American letters, in your opinion?
Well, for one thing, he's the first American author you think of when you say American literature, or Mark Twain.
Your audio's out. It's out. Can't hear you.
No luck.
Now you're back. Now you're back. Okay, you were talking about Ernest Hemingway and Mark Twain as the two men you think of first when you hear about American literature. Is that correct?
That's what I think most Europeans think when they think American literature. Those two names.
There's one other name. Let me throw in another name. Edgar Allan Poe.
Sure. The French in particular, because of the Baudelaire connection and the Baudelaire translation.
Right.
But the Germans definitely think Hemingway and Mark Twain.
Okay.
And I think with good reason, because they were both writers who were trying to write in the American vernacular and write about American themes, particularly Twain, obviously. And the stylistic significance of Hemingway is all bound up with 20th century modernism, of course. You know, he was buddies with Ezra Pound and James Joyce and mentored by Gertrude Stein, all those people in Paris in the early to mid 1920s, where you had this crucible of modernism. And so I would argue that Hemingway is the man you have to tackle if you're going to be trying to write literature as an American.
Okay, and I heard a quote once that from a famous critic, a well-known critic, that Hemingway is the most significant writer in English after William Shakespeare. Would you agree or disagree with that statement?
Well, not being a Shakespeare aficionado and not much caring for the Shakespeare that I have read, most of it being force-fed in high school, I can only agree, and then some. I like Hemingway better than Shakespeare.
Okay.
He's much simpler. People would argue that that's objectionable about him, his very plain-spoken vocabulary.
Well, Kev, I think you can. I think you can find no two different writers than Shakespeare and Hemingway. I mean, they're polar opposites, obviously, in their style.
And that's why I like Hemingway, and again Twain too. They were both trying to get away from that Shakespearean-influenced British prose.
I see.
And that's
you might see Hemingway as a reaction against Shakespeare and that style of florid prose. Actually, but Shakespeare is more poetry than prose, I would argue, by the way.
Okay, good. The sonnets and everything else, I've read them. They're fine. Yes. I'm not a Shakespeare man, as we can tell. And you can put that down to my ignorance of him. I haven't gone through all his various folios or whatever they're called.
Yeah.
So don't you know, don't think that I am, passing judgment a la Harold Bloom on the great man. I'm just telling you my preference is much more for Hemingway,
Okay.
and what I would argue is an American style, plain spoken,
Okay.
declarative sentences with as little ornament as possible, and telling a story that is more or less an American story. Although most of his novels and short stories, not most of his short stories, most of his novels are set outside of America. That's the irony of it. But
I've heard, speaking of this very spare style of Hemingway, I've heard that the basic thing on Hemingway is to eliminate the use of adjectives. It's more or less, so to speak.
yeah, well, that's what Ezra Pound tried to drill into him, and he did a good job. And I think it's good advice, because when you eliminate the adjectives, you are just your story is stripped bare. Your story stands there naked to the eye, and it better stand on its own 2 feet. So I think it's good advice, and that's it's a platitude. That Hemingway, he stripped his prose of all unnecessary adjectives, but it was a big step he took in that regard. And he wasn't the only one, obviously, but he was the most famous one, the most self-publicizing one, the most photogenic one, the guy who lived his prose,
Okay, now
who his life. They complemented each other in a big way.
Okay, so you've given us a bit of a nice general intro about Hemingway and his shtick. Can you go through his books one by one from the beginning of his career to the end of his career, and let's give a brief summary of your thoughts on each of his major works, at least.
Okay. Well, we just have to say right at the beginning, he published, I think it was 1938, the first 49 stories. And but he was writing these short stories throughout the 20s and 30s, mostly the 20s, I think. And but we'll leave. That will be like the compilation in 1938. But we have to address the short stories earlier that came out in magazines, and then later in Men Without Women, 1927, and then Winner Take Nothing, 1933. You better check me on those dates and the titles for those dates, but I think that's what they were. And then, of course, In Our Time in 1925. And so he trained as a short story writer. That was his first training. And I came back to Hemingway about 2 years ago, just to revisit him, as one does great authors, like I've done with Melville, like I've done with
Jack London,
with Nathaniel Hawthorne, Washington Irving, even recently. And I just do that. And I did that with Hemingway, and I thought, okay, good. He's the great short story writer, or I'm going to give the lie to that. Well, I wasn't able to. He is a great short story writer. Now, not all of his stuff is great, but a good portion of it. And if you can write great, and I mean capital G stuff, like maybe a third of your stuff can be termed great. And I, in fact, did a little categorical analysis of his stuff. Yeah, I'd say about a third of his stuff, at least a fourth of his stuff, of the 49 stories, is just bona fide great stuff that could, you could take any one of these stories and teach it in a creative writing course, and it would, the students would leave with some real good pointers as to how to craft a short story. I did go through this back then. It's not just for our talk, but some of the stories I love of his are The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber. That's maybe my favorite long short story of his. It's just beautifully constructed, and it's it's a nice story with a surprise ending, with a wow at the end, right? Usually Hemingway wanted to avoid those wows. He wanted to have the dying fall, but here was a big wow, and I won't, we won't spoil it for those who haven't read it. Capital of the World, kind of a bullfighting story. The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife, The 3-Day Blow, The Battler, Soldier's Home, In Another Country. Cetta Dice la Patria. My Italian is not what it could be. Is that how you pronounce it? Anyway, it's about a trip through fascist Italy in the 1920s. And A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, what I would argue is one of the great titles. The man was great with titles. He really was. And my favorite of his short stories. Can maybe you guess? I haven't mentioned it yet.
Cat in the Rain?
No, that's okay. I like The Killers.
Oh,
The Killers is a killer of a story that just cannot be beat. Bright Boy.
What about Hills Like White Elephants?
Yeah, that's fine, but I mean, these are the stories that usually make the lists, right? And what I will say is that one story I do not like, which is the perennial favorite, and all those who
Big Two-Hearted River.
I'm not a fan of that. No, not really. But the one I'm going to target here, and all those who love Hemingway and have maybe tuned in because they think they're going to get a Hemingway panegyric or something. Not in this case. I dislike actively the what is the name of it? Indian Camp.
Oh,
I dislike that story. Why? Because it's just not to be believed. You have Indian in the upper bunk and his wife in the lower bunk who's been screaming her head off for the past 2 days trying to give birth to their child. And then finally they get the doctor, the father of the narrator, and he comes in, and just as he's performing the operation of cesarean section to get the kid out, this Indian husband in the top bunk, he slits his throat. I mean, come on, dude. You took it for 2 days. Look, here's some advice. You can't take the last 5 minutes. Get down off the bunk, go for a walk. When you come back, everything's cool. The baby's there, or maybe it died. I guess it died in the story, but he slits his throat. I mean, come on. I just have never been able to buy that. So it's a little bit like, I mean, maybe the rest of the story is fine, but that's the core of the story, right? It doesn't work for me. Now, so don't like it. Indian Camp.
You said you like The Killers. What, in contrast to what you didn't like in Indian Camp, what do you like in The Killers that sets it apart?
Well, it's believable. You got a couple guys, couple gangsters from Chicago coming into this town outside of Chicago, and they're looking for this guy, Ole Anderson, I guess is his name, something like that.
No spoilers, please.
No spoilers, but they're looking to knock him off. They got a contract out on him, and while I guess they know where he is, or they're trying to ask around or something, but they come into this diner, and they want something to eat, before they rub this guy out. And they start talking tough, and then the 3 people in the diner, they get in the crosshairs of the gangsters, the killers, and then they're rounded up behind the counter. It goes on and on, but it's just the dialogue. The dialogue's fantastic. Yeah. Bright Boy, and they keep repeating things.
Would you say that Hemingway is a master of dialogue?
Oh yes, indeed.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Even if it's not realistic, it how can you put it? Even if it's sometimes not realistic, even if it's like so laconic and spare that you think to yourself, well, no one really talks that way, but it has a nice rhythm to it, the back and forth of it, and it's the American vernacular again. I can just flip to the Killers just to give you an example. 264. Yeah, they come in here and they go, what do you do here nights? Al asked. Al's one of the gangsters. They eat the dinner, his friend said. This is the other gangster. They all come here and eat the big dinner. That's right, George said, and George is the guy running the diner. So you think that's right? Al asked George. Sure. You're a pretty bright boy, aren't you? Sure, said George. Well, you're not, said the other little man. Is he, Al? He's dumb, said Al. He turned to Nick. What's your name? Adams. Another bright boy, Al said. Ain't he a bright boy, Max? The town's full of bright boys, Max said. That kind of stuff. It's just fun, you know. And I heard from somewhere, probably on numerous occasions, that all the Hollywood script writers ever afterward, they patterned their own gangster, lingo and talk and rhythms after the Killers. That they all look to that their template as to how gangsters are supposed to talk. Whether they're supposed to talk that way or not, it sounds like they could, and you would almost like them to talk that way.
The gangster movies that would be employing such dialogues would be the film noir. Do you think Hemingway is a key influence on the genre of film noir? Would there be film noir had there not been a Hemingway?
Well, film noir is largely on the hard-boiled detective fiction written by the likes of Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler.
And James M. Cain.
And James M. Cain, indeed. And so these three fellows, Horace McCoy, there's others, who were publishing in Black Mask and Dime Detective and other magazines of the 30s. Well, Hammett was sort of done writing by the early 30s, but Chandler and company, they made no secret of the fact that they were taking their cue from Hemingway in his kind of dialogue to get their hard-boiled style across.
I see.
So these guys whose stuff became the content of these films, The Big Sleep, most famous example from Chandler's The Big Sleep, they made no secret of the fact that they were deriving their style from Hemingway.
I see.
And so that's how it connects. That's how I connect up, this little story, The Killers, with your film noir. I think there's no question that Hemingway played a great role in that kind of film noir, hard-boiled style.
Okay, Kev. So why don't we go through his novel?
And just let me add, that's probably why I like The Killers so much, because we might have another session where we just talk about Raymond Chandler. Raymond Chandler is another one of my literary gods, and so that certainly plays a role in why I dig The Killers so much.
Well, I was thinking that next week we're going to be doing some Jack London survey. I was thinking after Jack London, let's do just a session on L.A. writers, and we could get Chandler, Cain, and Bukowski, and maybe a couple others right in that one big session there.
Sure.
Do that after London. Okay, so please tell us, what are the major novels of Hemingway?
Right. So Hemingway perfects his...
In chronological order, what are his great novels, and what would you like or dislike about them? We can't hear you. Your audio is out and your image is frozen. Hopefully this will come back in a moment, the Wi-Fi. Hello, are you there? Hello, hello, hello. Come back.
Here you are. Here.
Okay, Kev, you phased out there. Let me repeat my question to you. Why don't you walk us through the major novels of Hemingway and tell us what you like or dislike about them chronologically?
Okay. Okay, we'll leave aside the Torrents of Spring. That was to basically get him out of his contract with Horace Live Rights. We could go over to Scribner's. Enough said. It's not much. It's 100 pages. It's supposed to be funny. I don't find it funny at all. Okay. His first great novel, and I would argue his greatest novel, is The Sun Also Rises. Okay. And what can I say? But he was taking his short story technique, that finely honed and crafted prose, and he was taking that, into 280 pages or whatever it is. And you just see it. It has that tensile and that brevity, and it just packs a punch with every line. And the tragedy of Hemingway is that he never got back to that until later on, posthumously, with A Movable Feast. I would argue he got back to that sort of poetic style, and that very disciplined style.
Have you passed over A Farewell to Arms, or is that coming up?
No, it's coming up. So I just want to say that I love, The Sun Also Rises.
Okay.
And I was just jumping ahead to A Movable Feast because that was based on diary entries and journal entries and other, papers relevant to his time in Paris when he was trained to be a writer in the early 20s. And then he wrote that up into sort of like a memoir of his time in Paris. And then the magic happened again, that you had this prose style that was just beautifully naked and just stripped of all ornament. And so we're cutting ahead, but I'm doing that just to show you that this early period in Paris is the Hemingway I love the most. The next novel is A Farewell to Arms, which is quite something. I'm a fan of it as well. But I have to be a naysayer now that I think, after coming off a novel with a great female antagonist, Lady Brett Ashley, and when they talk about Hemingway not being able to write female characters, I always send them straight to The Sun Also Rises, to Lady Brett Ashley. I don't know of any greater, more colorful, more vibrant, more vital female character in 20th century American literature than her. Not that I have read. I'm sure they're out there. Okay, let the complaints begin. But coming off of her in The Sun Also Rises, then to Catherine Barclay in A Farewell to Arms, 1929. Sun Also Rises was 1926. It's a great disappointment because she's such a cipher. She's just null. She's nothing. And Frederick Henry, who's not a cipher, who's a real proactive character, and he does stuff, things that don't just happen to him, which is sort of arguably the case with Jake. He's a very passive character. But Frederick Henry is a real active character. I mean, he goes AWOL and, escapes a firing squad and goes to Switzerland, all these things. But his love interest is just a disappointment. And every time he's around her, this cipher, he's a cipher too. And the whole book just takes a nosedive in terms of charisma and excitement. So I like it. I like it very much, but I don't love it like I do The Sun Also Rises, and it has to do with this Catherine Barclay. Okay, I mean and then that birthing scene at the end, it's like 20 pages or something, where she's trying to give birth to the kid. She was trying to give birth to the kid, and actually, when I read that, I was thinking, come on, get the thing out, and then I could have sympathy with that Indian in the top bunk. I was about to slit my own throat, right? I mean, it goes on forever. Okay. So, those are my two caveats. The
Okay.
final chapter with her trying to give birth to that kid takes forever. And she herself, I don't mean to be morbid, but, I didn't mourn her death. I thought, oh, geez. Now, if we just continue the book without Catherine Barkley, we might get a classic like The Sun Also Rises. So there you have it.
Okay, so those are his first two major novels then, Sun Also Rises and Farewell to Arms.
Right.
And you're not mentioning Torrents of Spring because that was just a satire on Sherwood Anderson, and you're not convinced by that. Okay, so what comes after Farewell to Arms that's of significance in his oeuvre?
Well, his major work is then Death in the Afternoon, which it's not a novel, as we've established, right? It's
last discussion we established that, yeah.
Yes, it's a survey of Spanish bullfighting, okay? And it's just great stuff. It's not only about bullfighting, though. It's about everything. It's about Spain. It's about writing. And I just wanted to read this passage briefly, where he right in the first page, he talks about, I was trying to write then, and I found the greatest difficulty, aside from knowing truly what you really felt rather than what you were supposed to feel and had been taught to feel, was to put down what really happened in action, what the actual things were which produced the emotion that you experienced. Okay, so he's using bullfighting to show us how he learned to write. So you travel into his creative process here a little bit, which I find fascinating. And then the prose is just magnificent. I mean, I could talk about it all day and night, but we have to move on because I think we're already about 15 or 20 minutes in, and there are many books to talk about. But I love Death in the Afternoon. Is there any questions you might want to pose regarding same?
Death in the Afternoon. No, I guess I don't have any specific questions, but I'm just hoping to make sure we cover all the major novels, and then we could go back if we have more time and go.
You hear this phrase often in association with Hemingway, grace under pressure, right? Well, that's what the bullfighter was for him, grace under pressure. And that's basically his thesis. He's trying to make a case for this being a tragedy, a performative art in a tragic form. And that the bullfighter, his performance is not like that of an actor on the stage, but if he screws up, he will die. And this is what Hemingway's all about. It's like, you mentioned this in our last video, you better be skillful at the task you have chosen for yourself. You better know, you better have knowledge, you better have experience, you better have talent, or else you will die, and not only in a figurative way, but literally. Death in the Afternoon. And for my money, last word on this, it's the greatest title in American literature apart Carson McCullers' The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. That's my favorite title in American literature, but Death in the Afternoon is the second. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, well, you quoted the opening page there, and I kind of wasn't paying attention too much because I was thinking of my next question. One thing I remember on that first page, tell me if you already mentioned it there, is he said that he wanted to go to the bullfights because it's all about death, life and death. And he said those were such two fundamental themes for someone who wants to be a writer. And so this is the reason he went to examine the bullfights. Did you cover that in your quote there?
Yeah. No, I didn't cover it, but that's exactly what he says.
Yeah.
The only place where you could see life and death, i.e. violent death now that the wars were over, was in the bull ring, and I wanted very much to go to Spain where I could study it. I was learning to write. I was trying to learn to write, commencing with the simplest things, and one of the simplest things of all and the most fundamental is violent death. So there you have it.
All right. So going to the bullfights in order to learn how to be a writer, that very Hemingway-esque right there. And what comes after Death in the Afternoon in his collected works?
Right. Well, I mean, short stories, again, 33, I think it was, Winner Take Nothing. But then you have, I'm looking at, I have his books here. Then you have in 1935, The Green Hills of Africa. And that's one that isn't often mentioned when they talk about Hemingway, as Death in the Afternoon is not often mentioned. But it's good that The Green Hills of Africa is not mentioned. Not a fan. And I mean, just best to read from it. This is what he says in the foreword. I will just read this short paragraph. He himself writes this about his book. Unlike many novels, none of the characters or incidents in this book is imaginary. So, like most writers, even if they're taking directly from their life, they'll just put a disclaimer saying this has nothing to do with anyone in my real life. It's just all invented, right? Even if it's not true. It's just a disclaimer to avoid any libel or something, right? But he comes out and says all of these are true. Okay, that's an interesting twist. Unlike many novels, none of the characters or incidents in this book is imaginary. Anyone not finding sufficient love interest is at liberty while reading it to insert whatever love interest he or she may have at the time. Okay, being kind of jocular. The writer has attempted to write an absolutely true book to see whether the shape of a country, namely Africa, and the pattern of a month's action, namely his safari, and primarily in quest of the greater kudu, that's the big drama here at the heart of this. He's in competition with another guy, and they're trying to see who can shoot the kudu with the biggest horns. The writer has attempted to write an absolutely true book to see whether the shape of a country and the pattern of a month's action can, if truly presented, compete with the work of the imagination. And my answer to this is no, it cannot. It failed for me in many respects, but the main respect is, and it's my own shortcoming, I don't care to learn about, what was his phrase? The shape of a country. And one fault I can find in Hemingway, and he repeats this fault, is he's describing too much landscape. There's just too much of that for me. I'm a city boy, I guess. I have no head for plants and trees, and he'll go on pages and pages about fording the ravine and then going up the hill and seeing the lovely view. Lovely, a favorite word of his. And then, plunging down back into the valley. And I don't like that. I like descriptions of human, or in this case, also animal human interaction. That's fine. So I'm more for the pattern of, what was his phrase? The pattern of action. As a pattern of a month's action, as opposed to the shape of the country. There's much too much of that. I don't like it.
So Green Hills of Africa, and then what comes after that?
After that, we have then he wrote two good long short stories, which are always anthologized. The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber, and you then have the Snows of Kilimanjaro. He wrote those two shortly afterwards. Leave those aside, they're very good. I like Macomber better than Kilimanjaro. His next novel was To Have and Have Not, and that was 1937. And just to make this very brief, I would rather not. I read it a couple times. I thought I'd give him a second chance, and just didn't do it for me. This book also got panned by the critics, so I'm not alone. And the first part's good. It's about a smuggling operation, and it's good. It's gripping. More kind of in the hard-boiled fiction mode, and you can see why Howard Hawks decided to make a movie of it. I think it was Howard Hawks, along with Bogart and Bacall again, or the first time even. And but the rest is just, you have all kinds of differing perspectives. The writing is flaccid. It goes on and on. It's not the Hemingway I've grown to love. So I say no to Have and Have Not. If you want to know more about the book, well, just read it, and you'll see I'm right.
Well, before we move on to the next major work of Hemingway, it might be an interesting discussion to talk about all the Hemingway that's been made into Hollywood films. There's probably no writer in the 20th century who had more of their works made into films than Hemingway, and on a big level. I mean, with good production values, great actors. I don't know an author who's had more of their work converted into films like Hemingway. Do you think that would be an interesting discussion at some point? Not today, of course.
Maybe. I haven't seen all those films though. I mean, for example, I've never seen Old Man and the Sea with Spencer Tracy. There are gaps.
Then you've got To Have and Have Not with Bogey and Bacall. Then you've got the For Whom the Bell Tolls with Bergman and Gary Cooper.
Yeah.
And then you have A Farewell to Arms with Gary Cooper and I forget the name of the Helen Hayes. There's a lot of great films made out of Hemingway. We might want to spend a whole session on that. I don't want to get too deep.
We can maybe do that, but let's stick right now with For Whom the Bell Tolls, okay? And
okay, let's go to that.
Yeah. I don't like it. I don't like the novel. This is, again, sacrilege. Although I've heard others who are much more learned and scholarly than I say the same thing about Farewell to Arms, or For Whom the Bell Tolls, excuse me. Now, I have a first edition from 1940. How do you like that?
Wow.
You see it? Yeah. I found that in the German flea market.
That's great.
And the guy didn't know what he had. I thought, Jesus, I'll buy this.
How much you get it for? Like $1?
For like €1 or something. It was
a euro.
It was actually Deutschmarks back then. It was probably like a couple Deutschmarks. I bought it.
Okay.
And I had read it before, and I didn't much care for it, so I bought it this time. I thought, well, maybe there'll be a certain magic in reading the first edition. You know, Ernest's signature there on the cover. They got it kind of embossed there, right? Yeah. So I went, nah, didn't help. It's 471 pages of large pages with very close print. Much too long. Much too long. It could be cut by half easily, and then been much improved for it. What don't I like? You sometimes can't tell who's talking. I mean, there's so many characters. There's so many partisans. It's about a guy, American, and he goes to Spain to fight on the side of the Republic, and he joins up with a group of guerrillas, Guerillas, and he's going to blow up a bridge. And you have all these various characters, and they all get sort of mixed in with one another. It's hard to delineate the personality through just their conversation. I was lost at a certain point, I have to say. It was very self-indulgent, I felt. He was just listening to himself talk. It felt that way. A big difference between this and The Sun Also Rises. Very disciplined Hemingway and The Sun Also Rises. This is a Hemingway just saying, yeah, as if he's getting paid by the word like he used to be paid as a journalist back in the early 1920s when he was still working as a reporter. It just goes on and on. However, there are great sections, and this is the conundrum you come to with great writers. And it is that sometimes they'll write long books and you just say, phooey, you know, it's just not worth it. But there are sections there that are fantastic. They're magnificent. What are they in this book? Well, for example, the El Sordo. El Sordo is this half-deaf guy, and he has this battle on a hill. It's fantastic. It's really beautiful. It comes alive, and it's very funny too. And what else? What are the other parts? Okay, running the fascists off the cliff. That's very dramatic stuff, and Hemingway does a great job of that. It's a great finale. So you got like and then this. Oh yeah, the odor of death. There's a section about the odor of death where Pilar describes the odor of death. There's some great sections, but it's sort of like Wagner, right? For me, with Wagner, okay, there's some great sections in Götterdämmerung, but 5 hours to get those, you got to ask yourself how much you do actually love Wagner. And I know you do, but I don't love Wagner that much that I can, and I have at the Deutsche Oper many years back, I sat through Götterdämmerung, and there are some spine-tingling sections like Siegfried's Funeral March, just spine-tingling. It's worth it, those 5 hours to experience it, but you don't want to go back and do it again, okay? It's just too much money, it's too much time.
Hey,
And that's the same thing with a great novel like, or with a great novelist, with a great writer like Hemingway. Great sections there, but you don't want to go back and read the whole thing. In fact, last night, just to test if those sections were still great for me, I went back and read, El Sordo's Battle on the Hilltop. Fantastic stuff, really great stuff. But I didn't have to read the 250 pages prior to get to that. I already knew the story, so I just dipped right into it. That's all I need. It's like great. It's like songs from musicals. Maybe one or two will come out and become part of the the pop.
Like send in the clowns, right?
Right. Who knows any other tune of Sondheim's? But that one is one that everyone knows, right?
And it is great.
So he has justified his existence just on the basis of that one tune. And Hemingway as well. But it doesn't mean I love the musical or I love the book whence it came.
I got you. Okay, Kevin, very, very good summary.
In that eternal sleeping bag, it just drives you nuts, The earth moved in the sleeping bag. I mean, come on, baby.
All right. So what's after For Whom the Bell Tolls?
Well, then, by the way, this was like his biggest hit, in 1940, 41.
Well, the film helped out, too, with the popularity of that novel.
No doubt, right. Well, it took him a while. He was in a war. He was married to Martha Gellhorn, who was a war in and of herself. I love Martha Gellhorn, by the way. Excellent writer in her own right. The only wife of Hemingway's who left him, essentially. Quite a woman. And so he was busy. He finally came out in 1950, I think it was, with Across the River and Into the Trees. I sometimes screw up that title. I say Through the Trees, Across the River and Into the Trees. Yes. I read it again recently, about 7 or 8 months ago. Bad novel. Very poor. And why? Well, it's 3 days in Venice after the Second World War. And it's an eternity for the reader, though. It's about a colonel who is he knows he's going to be dying sooner. He suspects he will, of a heart condition. And he's determined to enjoy his last days. And he hooks up with a young Venetian girl. They're apparently lovers. It's not, made 100% clear, but it's pretty clear. And he wines and dines her, and he talks about the old days, and she sits at his feet and just worships him, and it's just sickening. Because this is Hemingway's alter ego, and he's just doesn't work. I think it's the critics are almost universal in their dismissal of this book. Okay. So I'm not the only one again.
All right, anyway. What comes after that one?
Old Man in the Sea, where he redeems himself, in my eyes, for not only To Have and Have Not, and For Whom the Bell Tolls, and Across the River and Into the Trees. With this little book of, about 120, 30 pages, he redeems himself, right? Great novel. I love The Old Man in the Sea. And, people argue it's kitsch. Well, life can be kitschy, and to quote Oscar Hammerstein.
Kevin, didn't he win the Nobel Prize for Literature based on the strength of Old Man in the Sea? Wasn't that
right? you win it for your career output, but that was the occasion of it, that he had this big
that
hit.
triggers the actual award. Yeah.
That triggered the award, right? Right.
Okay, so it does have merit even among the cognoscenti. Yeah.
Yes, but you see what it's shaping up into. I love the Hemingway. I love the shorter Hemingway. You know, when he gets into these overblown novels, it just doesn't work for me.
Well, Kevin, then that feeds into Gore Vidal saying in his preface to the Edith Wharton omnibus, saying that Hemingway was a short story writer, so he can't consider him. When he was talking about who the great American novelists are, he said the two greats are Edith Wharton and Henry James. And he said that he dismissed Hemingway and a couple others as mere short story writers. So would that play into Gore Vidal's thoughts that he was great in the short story? And
it would play into them, but the implication in his statement, I don't know if he used the word, but mere, you know, he's much more than just a mere short story writer, because he wrote one, in my book, a solid gold masterpiece, which is The Sun Also Rises. And he also wrote, in most people's book, a beautiful little gem of a novel, The Old Man of the Sea. And he also wrote A Movable Feast, which I would call a novel, a sort of a fictionalized version of his life, I think, in many respects. But that's also that's beautiful. So if you have three beautiful non-short stories to your name, I think you're more than just a short story writer.
I can also say in defense of him.
Just let me say this, Tim. Some novelists make their reputation based on just one novel. For example, Harper Lee, To Kill a Mockingbird. She wrote that in 1960. Then her next novel came out in 2015, Go Tell a Watchman or something, which is basically an earlier draft of To Kill a Mockingbird. So it should never have been published. I mean, that's what most people say.
Well,
so she's basically a one novel novelist. We call her a novelist. Ralph Ellison won the National Book Award with Invisible Man. That's the only novel he published in his lifetime. We call him a novelist. So Hemingway's got three at least great novels, not to mention Death in the Afternoon, which is sort of a sui generis thing. He's more than just a short story writer. I'm sorry, Mr. Vidal.
Okay, so and I hope I'm quoting him correctly. I'll double check on that quote. But I do believe
you are. I read that myself. Yes.
Okay. All right. So let's finish. We're almost done here. We only have about 5 to 10 more minutes. I can say that one of my favorite novels of Hemingway is A Farewell to Arms. I wasn't as bothered by the final scene as you were, but I can say this in defense of the novel. It's got one of the greatest opening paragraphs I've ever read in literature. Do you have the book handy, and could you possibly read the opening page for us?
Yeah, I'd like it. I don't think it's. Yeah, but I'm not on the bandwagon with one of the greatest openings in literature. It's nice.
All right. Maybe you can correct my impression on that.
Gatsby's good too. You know, that's a good opening.
The way he paints that opening landscape.
Bukowski's Post Office, the first page is great. You know, the first line, it started out as a mistake. You know, it's fantastic. Call Me Ishmael. There are all kinds of great, but this always
that's the greatest. Call Me Ishmael is probably the greatest opening line, arguably. But the whole opening paragraph of this Son Also of Farewell to Arms is really quite good, I should say.
Well, in the late summer of that year, we lived in a house in a village that looked across the river and the plain to the mountains. In the bed of the river, there were pebbles and boulders, dry and white in the sun, and the water was clear and swiftly moving and blue in the channels. Troops went by the house and down the road, and the dust they raised powdered the leaves of the trees. The trunks of the trees, too, were dusty, and the leaves fell early that year, and we saw the troops marching along the road, and the dust rising, and leaves stirred by the breeze falling, and the soldiers marching, and afterward the road bare and white, except for the leaves. That's fine. But for me, it's not. Okay, good. But for me, it's not so super great. Sometimes, I mean, he's written other passages. For example, the final lines, I would argue, to Death in the Afternoon. They're some of my favorites in all of literature, where he goes through all of the things that he didn't write in Death in the Afternoon. He says, "Well, I could if it had been enough of a book, I would have included how Pamplona looked in the evening after you'd had 5 beers and stuff. The whole Hemingway shtick."
Oh, I see.
But
Other
then
things
he
he
finally
didn't write.
goes, yeah. He finishes off by saying, "The great thing is to last and get your work done and see and hear and learn and understand and write when there is something that you know and not before and not too damned much after. Let those who want to save the world, if you can get to see it clear and as a whole." Excuse me, I read that badly. Let those who want to save the world, if you I'm arguing it's a great passage, but I can't even get the sentence out. Let those who want to save the world, if you can get to see it clear and as a whole. Then any part you make will represent the whole if it's made truly. The thing to do is work and learn to make it. No, it is not enough of a book, but still there were a few things to be said. There were a few practical things to be said. Okay, I muffed that. But the point is that what I often see with these vaunted passages, it's like, yeah, it's fine. It's solid prose, but it has got so much hype over the years that it becomes this thing that you have to fall down in reverence to. I don't. I think it's good, solid prose. It's good, solid Hemingway. There are many passages that are equally good, if not better, in his and other writers. And I'm not saying I could write as well as that, but I've written passages that are good and solid and are somewhat poetic, and would, if I got a break, maybe I would, become hailed as this, great writer of the greatest opening of a novel in the history of the world. I don't buy it. I think it's fine, but
I will say, I thought your opening line,
exceptional.
I do think your opening paragraph, page 1 of Postdoc, is quite good too. I'm gonna put that
That's
up
what I'm
there.
saying. That's what I'm saying. It's serviceable, and it's even more than serviceable. But you know how many more than serviceable opening passages there are to novels?
Well,
They're all over the place. But his gets the rep for being the greatest. So I gotta. It's not.
well,
I come back.
I would say his opening page of Farewell to Arms is more than serviceable because it's very poetic and imagistic. I think when they talk about him as another Cézanne, what Cézanne did for painting, he did for literature. I think it's right in that crux right there. A wonderful imagistic open. But anyway, listen, we better move on. Is there any final thoughts on Hemingway before we finish our video here?
One thing I want to say about Hemingway, and we'll be talking maybe about Jack London next week.
Next time, Jack London.
Is one thing I really resent about Hemingway. He gave no credit to Jack London ever.
Okay.
For having shaped his prose or his subject matter.
Okay.
None at all. And if you read Jack London, which I know you're doing right now,
correct.
In certain, not all of his work, but also not in all of Hemingway's work, as we've ascertained, you have that same punchy, stripped-down prose, often describing the same themes that Hemingway would take up.
Interesting.
Violent situations, mano a mano. In London, though, it was surcharged because it was not only mano a mano, it was man against his environment. A larger theme, a scarier theme, the white silence. Jack did it before Ernest, and Hemingway grew up with London in the very years when London was the biggest thing on earth. Okay, the aughts and the teens.
Okay.
Right when Hemingway was in his impressionable years. Hemingway born 1899, London, was publishing 1899, 1900 until his death.
I do see a strong comparison between London and Hemingway in their naturalistic view of things, the naturalism and the realism. But I've heard or I've read that the #1 selling novel from 1900 to 1925 was Main Street by Sinclair Lewis. So I might argue the point that London wasn't the biggest thing. Sinclair Lewis may have been the biggest thing, but listen, London was obviously formidable.
No. Sinclair Lewis didn't publish Main Street till like the 1920s, and I'm talking about the formative years of Hemingway.
Okay.
He was reading all this stuff. He was certainly reading all this stuff, and his themes, courage, primarily, that was a major theme of London's. You know.
Okay.
And also, London was the first to write a bullfight story.
Well, you know, London. What I see Hemingway doing, what I see Hemingway doing that London also did prior to him was he put people into he put men in extreme conditions and see how they're going to react in that case.
Correct, which is what I like. And also, the author as a media star, as adventurer in his own right.
I got you.
London was doing all that before Hemingway.
London was acting out. He was living life and then writing about it. He wasn't just in a study imagining.
Right.
And Hemingway would do the same thing.
Which I would argue is a real template for the American author, kind of a two-fisted guy. You know, Norman Mailer gets in fights, stabs his wife. You know, he's out there in the world getting into all kinds of trouble.
Which brings us back to your own literature, which we talked about last week. So for anybody who'd like to know Kevin as a successor of Jack London and Ernest Hemingway, not to mention Raymond Chandler or Bukowski,
more
your
London
literature now.
Yeah.
All right,
but
Kevin,
anyway,
stop on that note.
Okay, I just want to say one last thing though.
Yeah.
Okay. And you know because Ernest never mentioned London ever. You know that he was you know that he probably played a real great role in his formation as a writer, or his inspiration to be a writer, at least. So
okay, I hear you. Maybe he was using his iceberg technique on London. The less I say about him, the more there is of him. You know.
Well, we can end with this one. Fitzgerald had a great quote about Hemingway, who was very reluctant to give any kind of credit to anyone. I mean, the only guy he really gave true credit to was Ezra Pound, because Ezra was not a threat. You know, Ezra's doing his cantos. Who the heck knows what he's even saying in these things we're trying to do. So he's no threat. So he gave Ezra all the credit in the world for helping, form him as a writer. But Fitzgerald one time said, or wrote, I think, he said that Ernest was always willing to give a hand to the fellow on the ledge above him. There you have it. So he was very ambitious, Mr. Hemingway, and he was always willing to, let me help you out here and pull myself up as I do so. But, the people who'd helped him along the way, he wanted to leave them behind. He didn't want to mention them and sully his own stardom. So, I mean, I have problems with Hemingway as a person, but, his prose is angelic and, kingly, as I also described it last time. So,
all right, Kevin, thank you very much. That will be the end of our discussion. We'll be back with Jack London next week. Thank you.
All right. See you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.